And again, welcome to the Two Spirit presentation. We are the Alaska Region Training and Technical Assistance Center, which is hosting this webinar on behalf of ANA and the topic for Two Spirit today. Our staff consists of Anthony Kew'rhame, the Regional Director, myself, Angela, the Training and Technical Assistance Manager, and in a few days, a new staff member, Charles Peel, our Technology and E-Outreach Manager, as well as a pool of professional consultants. The Training and Technical Assistance Centers, of which there are 4, one in each region, provides free training in project planning, pre-application, and post-award. We provide free technical assistance. And for those of you who have recently submitted, I'm sure that you have used some of that for your pre-application. The project planning and development, as well as some assistance on site during the time that you are managing your project, and some unfunded and other grantee assistance. You can find information on our website at anaalaska.org. We also offer some Google Plus tools for communities in collaborating and sharing resources, both nationally and regionally. And there's an opportunity to connect with the National ANA website. ANA is offering series of webinars. One currently happening now is the evaluation series. This series will provide more information about evaluating and helping you achieve your community's goals, debunking a few of those myths surrounding evaluation, letting you know why it's really important to choose reliable and valid evaluation measures, 4 stages of the evaluation cycle, and how evaluation results can help build community support. The upcoming ones for this series are July 11th for Part 3 and July 25th for Part 4. 2 additional series that will be upcoming are the Sustainability series. This will provide an understanding of sustainability and methods to implement and receive a certificate of completion at the end of the full series, and the project implementation, knowledge for helping you implement your grant successfully, and again another certificate. Each of the series, if you have completed all 4 parts, offer that certificate. We're hosting this today in honor of June Pride Month. June Pride honors the 1969 Stonewall riots in Manhattan. These were a tipping point for the gay liberation movement in the United States. Today, many celebrations include parades and picnics, parties, workshops, symposiums, and attracts millions of participants around the world. Memorials are also held during this month for members of the community who have been lost to hate crimes or HIV and AIDS. In 1995, a resolution passed by the General Assembly of the National Education Association included LGBT History Month within a list of commemorative months. The purpose is to recognize the impact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals have had on history locally, nationally, and internationally. And the Law Library of Congress has compiled guides to commemorative observations and an inventory and presidential proclamations related to LGBT Pride Month. With that, I'd like to begin to introduce Harlan Pruden of the First Cree Nations. He will be our presenter today. Harlan has been living in New York since 1994 and is co-founder of the Northeast Two Spirit Society, where he works with New York's Two Spirit LGBT Native community. He is also one of the principal organizers of the National Confederacy of Two Spirit Organizations and was recently appointed to be an American representative on the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. In April 2013, Harlan was reappointed to Manhattan's Community Board 12 and is currently the only Native on an NYC community board. After committing himself to sobriety 27 years ago, Harlan was the first person in his family to attend college and now devotes his life to First Nations community organizing and other progressive causes. Welcome, Harlan, and I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. I would like to take this opportunity, first of all, to introduce myself, Dahtetse, Neto Jantik Harlan. I welcomed you in Cree. I am the co-founder as well as a council member for the Northeast Two Spirit Society. And I first of all want to wish everyone a happy Pride Month. I think every month should be Pride, and in my world it is Pride every month. I also would like to acknowledge such a historic time in which that we are existing and living in today. As was noted in today's article in Indian Country Today, where I was quoted, that the Supreme Court's decision is an equalizer for today's two-spirit married same-sex couples as it was before the colonizers came to this land. It has now come full circle, and once again, our relationships are celebrated and supported as that should have been all along. And so it is with incredibly, with a full heart that I stand here today, as well as virtually stand here on the webinar to give this presentation on Two Spirit Then and Now. But before I move forward, I do have to say that I thank the Commissioner of ANA, Lillian Sparks, for her leadership and making sure that the diversity celebration of June is marked at the American, at ANA. Also Courtney Roy and Lori King and Shay Walsh that were instrumental in making sure that this webinar happened in June. I have a lot of slides. I'm going to be buzzing through them really, really quickly. And first section is kind of like a Native 101, and I know that I'm probably preaching to the choir, so I'm going to buzz real quickly through them. So this is a map of what we would call Turtle Island. You all would know that as North America. And this was pulled together by Paula Glees, and you can see the major Native American nations and or people. And you can kind of see that the 49th parallel is like clearly marked, but it really wasn't marked for us as nation, as the indigenous people of this land. And now this is, and you're familiar with this map, is what we would call Indian country today, with the green areas being the reservations, the federal reservations. And also within this, you'll see that the 49th parallel is marked, and like Canada is kind of like this like sepia tone. And but what this map really kind of also represents is that many of the treaties were written with two different languages, two different vocabularies. One was as sovereign nations, as First Nations people, we entered into an agreement, and with the federal government. And the federal government wrote into these treaties that much of these lands are held in trust. And if you look at some of the treaties, that the federal government looks at us as wards of the state, no different from Child Protective Services if they go in and take custody of children. And so there's this like wacky dynamic where we speak in a language of sovereign people, sovereign First Nations, indigenous people, and the federal government looks at us as wards of the state. And you can kind of see that it sets up this wacky dynamic of relations and how do you govern those relations. These are states with populations over 100,000, and I bolded and highlighted New York, only because New York City is the home of the largest population of urban Indians living in a U.S. city. And so many people don't look at New York as Indian country. However, it is Indian country. Actually, all of this land that we stand on today is Indian country. And so I would also be remiss on my part that I don't acknowledge the Lenape that for this area. and we stand on their land, and we also have to honor those people in which that I stand on today. And so these are states that have high populations of Native people. The diversity of Native people. There are 5.6 million Indigenous Americans living in the United States, with another 1.3 in Canada. And they're divided up to about 1,166 recognized Native governments, approximately 600 in Canada and 596 here in the United States. And there are roughly about 225 Native languages that are spoken in the United States, with another 50 in Canada. But there are far more languages that are no longer spoken because the people they're no longer either able to speak, or the people themselves no longer exist. So that concludes like the Native 101. And why I have to do that is before we can actually enter into a dialogue or a discussion around Two-Spirit, is key to the concept of Two-Spirit, and I will explain this more into the presentation, is that the concept of Two-Spirit and the identity of Two-Spirit does not make sense unless it is contextualized within a larger Native American frame. Again, the concept of Two-Spirit does not make sense unless it is contextualized within a larger Native American community and or frame. So, a little bit of history about the term Two-Spirit. So from beginning of time to a little after first contact, within our own languages, for those traditions and those peoples and those nations that had a Two-Spirit history, we had our own words and our own language that signified Two-Spirit people. And then a little after first contact to 1989, the term was berdache was used. And berdache was, first of all, it's a French word, and it was given to us by French missionaries. And the French missionaries showed up, and they were like seeing these people that were wearing like a men's top or maybe and a woman's bottom, and they were like, this doesn't fit into our dichotomy, our polar gender system of a man and a woman. And so they were like, oh, I don't really understand this. And so what they did was they went into the language, and they found this Arabic-rooted word, baja, that was spread throughout Europe. It was translated into Italian, barrasso. It was also translated into Spanish, badaxa. And then in around the 16th century, the word was translated into French, and that's where we get the word berdache. But the Arabic translation of the word is a young man or boy who serves as another's succubus. Y'all have to Google that word because it's crazy. Permitting sodomy to be committed upon him or a passive homosexual partner, i.e. a bottom within sex. And around 1989, 1990 to today, at the third annual international, well now what we would call the third annual International Two-Spirit Gathering, a grand council was called and said, you know what, we hate this word berdache. One, it's French. Two, it's not honoring of who we are as people. And so there was much conversations and many, many rounds. And finally they landed on the term berdache. They landed on the term Two-Spirit. And the attendees for that gathering, they wanted a term that was reflective, that reflected the combination of masculinity and femininity, which are attributed to males in feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And there is a major difference and a shift that happened within that, that's hearkening back, that within the concept of Two-Spirit, yes, it is looking at sexual orientation, but there's also a gender analysis. And that's where that word, and that's where the definition comes in as males in feminine roles and females in masculine roles. And it is a hearkening back to our gender and gender diversity that happened in many traditional Native American communities. But before we actually dive into the difference between that, I want to do a little bit, what I would like to do is I will explain that more, the distinction between the sexual orientation and gender. But before I do that, what I would like to do is to share with you, as I've done this presentation around the country, I have collected probably about 180 terms within our own languages, those pre-terms, from the beginning of contact until berdache and Two-Spirit came along. And so for the next 7 slides, is all of these words that I've collected. And I put the term, although it says definitions, it should be really loose translations. And when I find native speakers, I try to get them to actually get the heart of the actual, what does the meaning of the word mean. And I've been collecting more and more of these words. Where there's a word, there is a people. And where there is a word, there is also history. And of course, you saw the Cree Nation, the best nation in the whole wide world. But we're not alone. In other cultures that are outside of North America and or Turtle Island, there is a similar sort of concept that we would call, that express gender diversity within their own languages. So one afternoon, I spent about an hour, 2 hours pulling this slide together, and this is by no means complete. You'll notice here that although it has Polynesia, there is no, the Maori have a term for it's kind of like a similar to Two Spirit people. There's the Indonesian, India with the Hydra, that have a similar sort of concept of this gender diversity that existed in these indigenous populations pre-colonization. And I often say that this is my next project, that once I finish organizing the LGBT Two-Spirit community here in the United States, is I'll launch and start an international movement, and this is my work slide. So there'll be more to come for that. So I would like to drill down, because I know that I've been using sexual orientation and gender. And so what I would like to do is to get some definitions out of the way so that we have a common language. So sexual orientation refers to an enduring, emotional, romantic, sexual, and affectional attraction towards others, usually conceived classifiably according to the sex of the person whom the individual finds attractive. I, as an anatomical male, find another anatomical male attractive, internal dialogue externalized with attraction that makes me gay. I, anatomical male, find a female, anatomical female attractive that makes me heterosexual. So it's an internal dialogue that then is expressed, and it's all around who do you find attractive. Where gender is socially defined, it dictates one's place and role within one's community. So how you make sense of that, like in the 1950s, there was much more rigid gender codes here in the United States. And if you look at like TV programs like Mad Men, you really kind of see that gender breakdown, where it was socially expected because of history that women were the caretakers and men were the breadwinners. And we collectively agreed to that. If we had a different history, we could have also agreed that women would be the breadwinners and men would be the caretakers. But because of our history, we socially agreed. And you can kind of see that that's being broken down within the last 20 years with the advent of the women's rights movement. And there's a blurring of what is your role or expectation as a woman and what is your role or expectation as a man. Why I painstakingly explain that and have to go into that is contemporarily is, for the Two-Spirit community, is yes, we are organizing LGBT Native Americans, sexual orientation plus the transgender community who are Native. However, in a traditional setting, because we were heterosexual normative, they were just straight people, many nations didn't have a corresponding word or concept for gay, lesbian, or bisexuality. All we had were genders, your role within your community. Some nations had 3 genders, some had 4 genders, and some actually had 6 different genders. So it is within that construct that you have these like different genders. Now I know that for in the Cree Nation, we had 4 different genders, and it was a social taboo for like 2 heterosexual men to hook up and have sex within their gender. It was also a social taboo for 2 heterosexual women to hook up and have sex within their gender. The same taboo held true, that you could not have two male-bodied two-spirit people could not hook up and have sex together within their gender. I, as a male-bodied two-spirit person, would take a straight man as my husband. My husband would do all of the things that were socially expected, including having sex. But we would never think of that individual, my husband, as being gay or even bisexual. He was a heterosexual male that was having sex. And so there's the rub and the tension, because yes, we're contemporarily working with sexual orientation, LGBT natives, and today, but in a traditional construct, we wouldn't make sense of that because it was more about your role or your function within your nation. So, and I'll explain some of the roles in a little bit. Now, to drive this point even a little further, as well as to demonstrate that this is not sexual orientation in a traditional construct, this is a painting by George Catlin, and it was, although the painting is called The Dance to the Winkta, it was the Sac and Fox. This is a picture of the Sac and Fox nation, and their two-spirit person would be called Ikukua, and not Winkta. Winkta is a Lakota word for their two-spirit people. And you can see that within the Sac and Fox nation, there was a camp chief and a war chief, kind of like a head of state, head of government. And it didn't matter how much the war chief said, we have to go to war, those darn Crees have wronged us and we have to defend our honor. It wasn't until their Winkta said, we will go to war on such and such time. So that tells me that there was an immense amount of political power that was held by this office of this gender, that they could overrule and veto a war chief and or the internal workings from a camp chief. And then on the eve of a battle, the Winkta would walk out into the middle of the field, or the Ikua, and all of the straight warriors would do this elaborate dance to try to catch the eye of the Winkta so that they could have sex with the Winkta pre-battle so they could have a little bit of that two-spirit spirit to go into war the next day. So these would be all straight identified Indians trying to hook up and have sex with another male-bodied person. But we wouldn't think of them as gay. They were straight warriors. So I often think that, you know, like, this is really cool, and I think at one point we were at 4 different wars, and so as a Cree male-bodied two-spirit person, I was like waiting for my dance to the Winkta. Joking, just teasing. So what were some of the roles of our two-spirit people pre-contact? So for two-spirit people, we were mediators. Like often, there was, you know, like many of our Plains people, there was a women's camp and a men's camp. And if you were a woman, you were never allowed in the men's camp. And if you were a man, you would never allow, a woman was never allowed into the men's camp, and a woman was never allowed in the man's camp. But if you were a blending of two spirits, both masculine and feminine, you could have access to both of those camps. So anytime that there was any sort of racial disharmony between, or tension between those two different camps, we as two-spirit people, we could go over to the women's camp and go, hey, what's going on, what's the story? Go over to the men's camp, you know, what's happening, and then go back and forth and to restore balance. That was a role, again, it's about your role, your gender, that was unique to us. Similarly, two-spirit people, that was on a communal level for the camps, but also on an individual level of brokering marriages, as well as dissolving partnerships and or marriages on an individual level. So that kind of explains and shows that the unique role for us as two-spirit people that shows that it's a social constructionist view of gender and how that there was multiple genders within our native nations. We're also social workers. Because we were so honored and respected, you know, we have giveaways. You know, if you have 2 blankets, you have 1 too many. And so as two-spirit people, because they were so valued and revered, when they would get all of these gifts, and so they always had an excess of resources, so they would distribute that and making sure that everyone in the nation was taken care of because they would always have an excess of resources. Specific ceremonies, like within the Lakota Nation, the highest honor that you can get in a naming ceremony is to get your name from a two-spirit individual, a Winkta. And I know that Del First has resurrected that ceremony for the Lakota people. Then there was also like the love potions and matchmakers, you know, the dissolving of relationships and making of relationships. We played a significant role within the sun dance. We were a holy people that told the future and brought good luck and prosperity to our nation. Also the puberty ceremony, peacemakers of nations. We joined war parties, and then we're also doctors and medicine people. Now this is an idealized list. There's not one nation that would have this. Our roles differed from nation to nation to nation. And so what you have to do is to go to a specific nation and ask what was the role of your two-spirit person, and you would get that breakdown. And what I want to do is to show that there are specific things in which that we, as male-bodied and female-bodied two-spirit people, that we provided a service or a role that was different, that not a straight person could provide within our nation. So who were some of our two-spirit people of long ago? This is Otish, who's Crow, as male-bodied two-spirit person, and Otish wanted to have a picture taken of how she was going to meet her creator. And so it was taken in 1929. Next slide. This is Wc-Wha of the Zuni nation. And Wc-Wha was like this really cool male-bodied two-spirit person. And in your resource directory, Roscoe actually wrote a biography, and the name of the book was written. The name of the book is Zuni Man Woman, and it was published in 1991. You'll receive your resource directory. It'll be emailed to everyone later today. But within that, there's an actual biography. Wc-Wha was revered by the Zuni nation, and President Cleveland Grover Cleveland was so taken by Wc-Wha, brought Wc-Wha to Washington, and Wc-Wha was like the toast of Washington. She was going to state dinners, and she was going to ambassador dinners, and then the president said, "Hey, let me have my physician do a physical on you." And so Wc-Wha said, "Sure." So they pulled up Wc-Wha's tunic and found a big old boy part. They were like, "You freak of nature," and they ran her out of Washington in disgrace, saying that we've been duped by this freak. You know, but Wc-Wha was just being Wc-Wha, a male-bodied two-spirit person that's Zuni. So it's a really cool little biography if you want to read it. This is Charlie the Weaver and his friend, and it was taken in 1895. And you can see that this is a perfect example of how obviously, Charlie is from the Southwest, is wearing a man's top and a female's bottom, a skirt. And that was to signify that she, sure, was a blending of both male and female spirits, and it was externalized with her dress. Now, there's not a lot of historical documentation of our female-bodied two-spirit people. And that's because a lot of the researchers, the anthropologists, were white males, and they were just concerned about what was going on in the male community at the expense of our female. So, but we do have a couple of examples, and this is a Quechan female-bodied two-spirit person that's wearing traditional male Quechan attire, and it was taken in 1890. This is, thank you. This is Lozen and Dahtetse. Again, Lozen, this is a picture that was taken with Geronimo, and you can kind of see the train in the background. This is when they were, when Geronimo was defeated and was put in a train and was being shipped down south somewhere. But Lozen and his wife, this is a female-bodied two-spirit person, were a part of his Geronimo's band. And in some of the writings that we have found, Lozen refers to Dahtetse as a wife and this enduring love that existed amongst them. Now, Dahtetse is a heterosexually identified woman that is in a relationship with another female-bodied two-spirit person. Again, driving home the point that this is not sexual orientation analysis pre-contact or even after contact. These are two Lakota, one of them being Winkte, and they lived together until their 90s, and the picture was taken in 1890. These are two Navajo boys. Oh, You know that slide in the earlier part of the presentation where I talked about diversity? And I often say that working within the Native community is like herding wet cats, because you can never get 100% agreement on anything, because we're so different. We're so many different nations. The Navajo, when you translate Two Spirit into Dene, the language of the Navajo, it means someone that's mentally crazy, not mentally sound. And so a lot of times the Navajo people will not use the term Two-Spirit because they don't want to say they're crazy, rightly so. So what they will actually do is to revert to their own language, Dene, and how they would refer to themselves is Nadle. And so really to be very mindful and respectful of my Navajo brothers and sisters, for this presentation, I should be saying the Two-Spirit and Nadle traditions, and making sure that I'm always separating out the Nadle from the Two-Spirit people, so I'm not being offensive. But in the matter of time, I'm only going to use Two-Spirit, but realize when I say Two-Spirit, I'm really saying Two-Spirit and Nadle traditions. This is an unidentified Nadle, and it's obviously a touristy picture. It's like, come on, let's get a picture with this Indian, right? And they're like, whoa, that's a big girl. And like, oh yeah, here, hold the baby. But probably not realizing that this was a male-bodied Two-Spirit person, a male-bodied Nadle. And I don't think that so many people wouldn't know who our Nadle and or Two-Spirit people were. That all changed. And for Two-Spirit people during the reservation system. You can still see that being played out today, that European and or Western beliefs are clashing with Native belief systems. We also see that the Christian belief systems have been forced upon Native people through the residential and boarding school experience, as well as Indian agents incarcerated our Two-Spirit people. The cutting of men's hair and forcing them to wear men's clothing, or girls to wear dresses, conforming our attire to the Western's two-gender system, intimidation, outright violence from church and government agents. Many leaders, elected officials, chiefs, elders were reluctant to defend their Two-Spirit people. So that was happening on one side of the spectrum, violence and hatred for our Two-Spirit people. On the other side is out of love and respect for our Two-Spirit people, our elders asked us to go underground. They would go to Charlie the Weaver and they would say, Charlie, put a pair of pants on and we won't talk about you being Two-Spirit. But after 2 or 3 generations of not mentioning or naming our Two-Spirit people, there was a collective forgetting. But on 2 spectrums, one out of hate and intimidation and violence, and one out of love, brings us to the same end point of this collective forgetting of us as Two-Spirit people, that we were a part of the very fabric within our Native nations. And so it is a 2-pronged sort of fight in which that we as Two-Spirit activists and leaders have to fight. One, to undo the impact of colonization, and also to be mindful and respectful and to reclaim that lost history, those lost words, those lost stories, and wisdom and teachings of us as Two-Spirit people. And that's the work that is before us Two-Spirit activists as well as leaders. There's no way that we can talk about Natives unless we make peace and or really understand this picture. This picture is of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School that was opened in 1879 and closed in 1918. And it is where you get that statement, kill the Indian to save the man, where there was this forced assimilation of us as Native people, where our Native children were rounded up like cattle, put onto trains, and shipped to these schools where they physically had their Indianness beaten out of them. And we can kind of see also within Canada from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that there was unprecedented sexual, physical, and spiritual violence that were perpetrated upon our Native children. It is also where we really had our Indianness beaten out of us. So this picture is really where my work is informed from, because a lot of my work is to undo that which was taken from us And you can kind of see in the pictures, you'll see all the boys with short hair. You also see there's like some sort of military ranking on some of the sleeves of the little boys. All the girls have long hair. They're all wearing dresses. There is no place in this picture for Charlie the Weaver to exist. And so you can kind of see that in that forced assimilation, our Two-Spirit people were forced out of this, or it was forced out of our community. And that stigmatization of us as Two-Spirit people is from this picture. You will also see in the bottom left-hand corner, the young girl, 1, 2, 3, 4th over with her arms crossed. I love her. You know, her arms are crossed. I was like, y'all can take my picture, but I am not letting you have me. It's these little acts of resistance that have allowed us to exist and to actually live today. And for that, I love her. I don't know who she is, but it's those little acts of resistance that has allowed me so that I can be here today to share these stories with you. This is a PSA from these residential and boarding schools. And this is Tom Torino, who is Navajo, not Two-Spirit, or he might have been Two-Spirit, or Natale, we don't know. But you can see on the left, savage, uncouth, uncivilized. And then on the right, yay, you know, short hair, civilized, speaks English. And they were saying that these were their success cases for us as Native people. I myself look at this picture and say, this is where we have to go to undo this and make peace and to return that which was taken from us. Some defining characteristics for Two-Spirit people. You know, there's no way that we can talk about Native people without talking about historical trauma or the impact of colonization. Also, how historical trauma bleeds into intergenerational trauma. You know, so many people want to look at that Carlisle school picture and say, that's in the past, you know, like what does it matter? That's like at the 1800s, right? I will tell you that my mother was ripped from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve, placed in a boarding school in Canada, and where she had her Indianness beaten out of her. She basically had a grade 3, a 3-year-old Cree working language. And what did my mother do? She had 3 beautiful children, and she beat the living crap out of us. She did what she knew. And it is how the historical trauma bleeds into intergenerational trauma and kicks off these cycles of abuse. Now, my mother struggled with her own alcoholism and drug addiction, serial monogamy. I cannot tell you how many boyfriends she had, but it was in this acting out. And I think that had a lot to do with her upbringing in the boarding school. And then there has to be some sort of peace and forgiveness as a son to my mother. But it really is that there is no way that you can make sense of the Native American experience until you look at historical trauma and today's residual intergenerational trauma that bleeds from that. We are one of the only people that have to provide tribal and or band membership when we take certain funding. No other ethnicity is held to that criteria. If I write a grant for providing services to one-armed gay Jewish men living in South Brooklyn, no one would ever say, prove that you're working with one-armed gay Jewish Brooklynites. But if we were to take money from certain funding sources, we have to prove that we're only providing services to the 596 federally recognized reservations, members of those nations. Third, many have truths, misconceptions, and stereotypes that pervade all aspects of Indian life, and we have to start actually actively deconstructing those myths and misconceptions. Like, so many people want to talk about the Mohawk steelworkers that built New York City, and you see those pictures of the Mohawk steelworkers sitting on the steel girders. Yes, they were brave. However, we've built up this myth and this misconception that they were fearless of heights and they were like one with the sky and one with the wind that made them like fearless of heights and they could build these amazing structures in New York. However, let's take a step back. Who do you give the job to that has the highest fatality and mortality rate to? The least valued within your community. Because if one dies, oh well, it's another dead Indian. Not even a dead Mohawk, it's another dead Indian. These men were incredibly courageous. However, they weren't mystical or magical. They were taking the only economic opportunity that was available to them to put food on their table, to be a provider to their families. We have to start looking at those stories, and we have to start looking at the reality and the harsh realities that those stories perpetrate, and start looking at what is behind those stories. Finally, we are such a small population. However, precisely because our numbers are so small, and because we're indigenous, that our community should be declared a top priority. For once we are gone, we're gone. You know, everyone wants to look at HIV/AIDS, and nationally, we only make up less than 1% of the new cases of HIV. However, in 2009, the Onondaga Nation had 3 new cases of HIV. So you're like, 3, big deal. That's not a big number, right? However, there are only 2,000 Onondaga left in the world, 700 living on the reservation. 3, if you look at the incidence rates, is 60 times greater than the national average. And in that respect, the numbers are not telling the appropriate stories, because everyone wants to look at Native Americans as one big monolith. But we're nations within nations, and we're small. But we have to start looking at and asserting our indigeneity. As indigenous people, once we're gone, we're gone. I know that I've been throwing out the term historical trauma, and so I just wanted to make sure that we're very clear in defining what historical trauma is. First and foremost, it is created. This is not like Superstorm Sandy rolling in and wiping out the Rockaways. This is created by legislation as well as policy. And it is a combination of an immense loss of traumatic events that are perpetrated upon an entire culture. For Native people, these include the loss of culture, language, land, people from diseases and war, ways of life, ceremony, as well as family structures, the core building block for societies and communities. And finally, the displacement of our Two-Spirit people. That is what historical trauma is, and that is where the work has to take place. Next slide. What is actually being done? So for us in the Two-Spirit movement, our elders say that our culture is the cure. And I know that this is also backed up by Dr. Joseph P. Gong from the University of Wisconsin, that looks at culture as treatment as well as culture as prevention. So what we look at is kind of like wellness envisioned. One of our elders within the Northeast Two-Spirit Society is Lakota, and there's that expression, Mitakuye, or all my relations, or everything is connected, everything is related. And so we have built our program and our work off of that expression. For us, what we see is there has to be a returning to the red way, and it has to be community-based, where community is healing and healing is community. And it's also a holistic approach to healing. What we fundamentally believe, and this is a shared belief with all of the Two-Spirit organizations, is that anything that increases cultural pride increases self-esteem, and when you have an increased self-esteem, you have better decision-making processes across the board. If you honor and respect and love who you are, you're going to take care of that vessel. So it's like negotiating safer sex, substance abuse and alcohol usage, diabetes, hypertension. But what we're trying to do is to tee people up to hear those positive messages by instilling greater cultural pride within for those people. So what is being done to bring back the Two-Spirit role? In 1979, Randy Burns in San Francisco founded the Gay American Indians, the first group of its kind that started that, kind of really started the discussion. There are now 16 Two-Spirit organizations in the country, and in your resource directory on page 3, it lists all of the organizations with their contact information and or their website. There are now Two-Spirit people are being included in a diversity celebrations, just like today, and you guys are part of that work, a part of that reclamation of coming, and the people that are listening on this webinar. There are drumming circles and or Two-Spirit drums that are coming online. There is one in Denver, there's one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Bevlin drum, and in San Francisco has also, right now, are starting to form a Two-Spirit drum. And there is also a coming back to the circle in reservations. The Montana Two Spirit Society marches in the Blackfoot Nations Parade each year, and the Blackfoot people stand and clap. And so that does my heart really well to see that people are welcoming their Two-Spirit people back to their nations, as well as national and international Two-Spirit gatherings that are being held in Canada and the United States. Here's a list of the Two-Spirit organizations that are also within the resource directory. What does NE2SS does? We have a threefold mission, and one is to educate LGBT, Native, and non-LGBT people about the role and who we are as Two-Spirit people, just like today, what we're doing. Increasing the visibility of the Two-Spirit community, and actually that's our advocacy work. And that simply is like showing up at the Pride Parade and marching in the Pride Parade, or like this morning I was at a National Institute for Health listening session, and I was advocating for their research priority to actually have a focus on the Two-Spirit community. So it's a part of advocating for us. And then the big component is to build community, where that's where the healing is community and community is healing, and that building that connectivity and making sure that that's firmly grounded within our community. What does our wellness work look like? And bingo is huge in the Native community. So we have hosted like bingo nights at the American Indian Community House. We've also done like learn to powwow dance, and we're going to be starting a new cycle of powwow dancing. Our funders, when we first started rolling out these posters, they were like, where's the HIV? Where is the prevention? Where's all of this stuff? And I'm like, we'll get there. But at the heart of our work is to create spaces that say, come and celebrate your nativeness. Come and celebrate your Two-Spiritness. And then once we have them engaged, and it's like, and these are alcohol and substance abuse free events, there's none of that happens. People have to show up sober and clean. Once they start celebrating their nativeness and their Two-Spiritness, that's when we can then start talking and having those discussions about safer sex, about substance abuse, linkage to care, getting tested, knowing your status. But that doesn't mean anything unless you have someone that honors and respects who they are as an individual in a community setting. This is a picture of our first annual Two-Spirit gathering. 33% of the participants were from New York. Folks drove from like Oklahoma, flew from California. There were like 17 states that were represented at our first gathering. This September, NE2SS, creator willing, we're still in fundraising mode, so we still have to raise some funds for this, but we are the host committee for the 25th Annual International Two-Spirit Gathering that will be held out on Long Island, September 18th to the 23rd. Now, there is I've been like throwing out other terms, and within these last two slides, it is these two slides that really kind of inform the work of many, if not all, of the Two-Spirit organizations in the country. This is a definition by Joseph Gong from the University of Wisconsin that defines decolonization. And decolonization is simply, he says simply, it's not. Is simply the intentional, reflective, and communal self-examination undertaken by Native and other formerly colonized peoples in the service of collective action that finds continuity with the tradition, pre-colonial past, as it charts a purposeful, distinctive, and self-determined post-colonial future. And I think that is where what we have to do is, yes, the day is past that we'll never have a dance to the wink day anymore, but there are other roles in which that we can actually resurrect and pull and integrate them as we march forward together in present time. And so that is the mission, and the work is to decolonize our people. And then the other kind of work of the Two-Spirit organization comes from Alexandria Wilson, who is Cree, and she's a professor at the University of Washington. The Cree, best nation in the whole wide world, talks about the coming out process as well as the coming in process. And there are many, many stages and models for that coming out process. But the final coming out process is is typically a declaration of an independent identity. A gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender person musters up the courage and anticipates conflicts, announces their sexuality to a friend or family member at the risk of being met with anger, resistance, violence, or flat-out rejection or abandonment. And for us as Two-Spirit people, we do go through a coming out process. And we do go through this, and we face challenges of this abandonment. But for Alex Wilson, and much of the work of the Two-Spirit organization, is to create a space for the coming in process. Two-Spirit coming in process is an Aboriginal person, she's Canadian, but it means native, an Aboriginal person who is gay, lesbian, or bisexual or transgender comes to understand their relationship to and place and value in their family, community, culture, history, and present-day world. Coming in is not a declaration or an announcement. It is simply presenting oneself as being fully present as an Aboriginal person who is GLBT. That is really kind of like speaks to the heart of what we try to do, is to create that space so that people can show up fully present and honoring of their Aboriginal and or Native identity and their GLBT identity. And with that, what I'm going to do is, like a couple of minutes, I just want to buzz through some pictures of contemporary Two-Spirit people. This is a picture of the Denver Two-Spirit Society. This is a Blackfoot Two-Spirit leader, Stephen Barrios, and his sisters, one of the leaders of the Tulsa Two-Spirit Society. Again, a picture of the Montana Two-Spirit Society and the banner that they march behind each year. This is a picture from the international gathering that was held in Montana a couple of years ago. And another photo of the powwow. This is men's traditional dance competition that we had at that gathering. This is a picture of the Tulsa Two-Spirit gathering and their drum. And once again, I have to thank you very much for your time and for you to take the time to actually try to learn about our Two-Spirit community. Hi, hi, and Exanaga.
Thank you very much, Harlan. At this time, we will allow Harlan to take some questions and answers. I have unmuted the microphones and audio. If you would please raise your hand, and then Harlan will be able to choose you and take your question. To speak, please push the talk button, and please press it again once you've finished answering your question. This will help us avoid feedback. Thank you. You can also type your question in the chat box should you not have a microphone. I see a few people beginning to type now. You will need to hit enter in order for your question to show up in the chat box.
Sure. So I see the two questions. Will this presentation be available? I actually have an updated presentation that will be emailed out to all of the participants, plus also the resource directory flyer that we call Just the Facts, and also a copy of the first ever statewide needs assessment that was done by the State of New York and their Department of Health. What was the other question? Yes, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted to ANA's website, And that link will also be shared with all of the participants for you all to share with your agency and or your community.
How long has the contemporary Two Spirit movement been active, reactivated?
Again, the contemporary Two Spirit movement, well, one, we would say we never went away. We just kind of went under the ground. But really, it was with Randy Burns and the founding of the Gay American Indians that really kind of like started that consciousness raising and articulation, and then it really kind of took off in 1990 with the formation of and the term of Two Spirit, and then from there we've been like moving forward with great guns, and we've had some amazing work within the last 18 months with the federal government. In your resource directory, you'll see SAMHSA, NACE, Native American Center for Excellence. They do a monthly Two Spirit webinar. There's also going to be a Train the Trainer for a Two Spirit trainer that's coming out of the University of the University of Iowa, to the CDC in their latest incidence and prevalence fact sheet with the term Two Spirit showing up in that. So there has been some amazing work as well as some real cool headways, and even for me to be standing here today at ANA and Children and Family Services and doing this presentation. Y'all are seeing this roll out right before your eyes, and so this is kind of historic, and so there's really cool stuff that's really happening today.
No other questions? One person said excellent presentation. This is from Patsy. Thank you very much. The pictures added a lot.
Patsy, thank you so much. If we don't get to all of the questions, I'll be sure to answer them and email them.
And during this question and answer time, you can see the evaluation on your screen. You can fill it out right on your screen, and we would appreciate that as it helps us to improve in the future.
That I have from a participant in the room was whether or not for the roles of the matchmaking and or the mediation between individuals, whether or not that has been resurrected. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I do know for the naming ceremony in Dell First, I don't know whether or not that role has happened, although I'm sure that there are folks that are doing it, but probably I don't know. So, but I will look into that and I'll ask around. Thank you very much, Carla. The Two-Spirit history, is there more acceptance for Two-Spirit people within Native communities as opposed to the general acceptance for LGBT people? Again, it's who you ask and what you ask. There are many Indians that have adopted Christianity as their religion, and the same sort of narrow-minded stigma and hatred that we see in the dominant society within major Christian denominations, not all denominations, but some denominations, is also heralded, and you hear that from Christianized Indians. Now, if you go to a traditionalist, us as Two-Spirit people, we naturally ally ourselves, because that's a part of the reclamation and the restoring of our place of honor, is to work with our traditionalists. But as a Native outsider, if you go to a traditionalist and you ask them about Two-Spirit, they would be really, really hesitant of like sharing that. Again, that slide about like out of intimidation or fear, many people are not, like, are out of protection and love. They don't want to talk about it also. So who you ask and how you ask it, you're going to get radically different questions and, different answers and different data. So, yes. Sure. That is, the question was, because we work in a highly urban area like New York City, are we going to expand out to reservations? So Sharon Day, who I believe is still a participant in the webinar, Sharon Day and I went to North Dakota and South Dakota, and we did 4 two-day trainings, and the training is listed on the resource directory on the last page. And it was for folks that are working in Native treatment centers. It was a training of how to provide more culturally appropriate services to the Two-Spirit people that present at their agency. We did one training in Bismarck, North Dakota, Grand Forks, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Rapid City, South Dakota. And we trained about 70 people. And people really wanted more information and really wanted to create a safe space for people that are accessing services on their agency. Out of those 2 trainings, I'm proud to announce that the Rosebud Reservation on July 26th is constructing an entire day conference built on Sharon and I, around Sharon and I. And so this is the first time for myself that I will be going to a reservation and doing a training. And we're also working with the Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin, and they want a training on their reservation too. So there is some, again, we're standing at a really cool time within Two-Spirit activism and Two-Spirit community organizing, in that we are going on to reservations, and that is really striking at the heart of the community. And so it does, again, I am with such a full heart. There's a really amazing work and amazing support that is happening. And so we're just building upon that and trying to like capitalize on it so that we can really affect change for our Two-Spirit people that are living on reservations as well as off reservations. But it is really from internal leadership like Marcita from the Eagle Bear, from the Rosebud Reservation that is clearing the path for us to come onto the reservation, or Lori from the Ho-Chunk Nation. So really looking at those requests and then finding the money to support that work so that we can go to reservations. We have yet to actually identify a funding source for both of those trainings, but I do know that one way or another, Sharon and I are going to be on the Rosebud Reservation come July 26th for this conference.
So I have a question. How do you, working with non-native LGBT community, you kind of spoke about the Mohawks, builders, but that romanticization of community, I feel like within the LGBT community, people call it general romanticization. So how do you work with, constructing that romanticization of the native, but also explaining the LGBT community way in which they overlap there?
So the question was, how do we work and engage the LGBT community to counter the eroticization of us as Native people, both men and women, male-bodied and female-bodied, and that's the hardest.
And then also address the LGBT overlap.
Oh, and then the overlap between our organizing effort and the LGBT organizing effort. So the first part is definitely doing and having grounded conversations like we had today around this and laying out the history is a way to do it. Although, and you know, in the gay community, if you have someone who, guys that all are only attracted to Asians, we call them race queens. I know it's not a nice term. And we have like a lot of these things that are like, we identify people as like race queens and all this other stuff. In the Native community, guys that fetishize Native guys, we call them dream catchers. That's a fun joke. But what we try to do is to really try to increase the history. The other thing is we do try to find that intersectionality of like destigmatizing, that we kind of stand in union with our LGBT brothers and sisters in the fight for equality. And then there is a big dissonance or rub in that we are saying that for the Two-Spirit identity, it is only for Native people that can claim that term. So we wall off that term. Because if everyone and anyone can claim that Two-Spirit term, then my job as a Two-Spirit community organizer is almost impossible, because how do I, if someone that shows up and presents that they're German, American, how do you restore or reclaim their, so it doesn't make sense. So what we try to do is to wall off and separate those other things. The other thing that there is a major rub, and it also speaks to today and this day that we are actually marking, and that's June's Pride Month, and the gay liberation movement starting in Stonewall in 1969, which always strikes me as so incredibly odd that there's this movement that is fighting for equality, yet at the same time they have never gone back to seriously analyze or to try to figure out a time in which that on this land, people who engage in same-sex relationships had full citizenship, full equality, acceptance, and were a part of our community. And so in that is, we are on that LGBT community of like questioning their entire historical land, or claim that the gay liberation may have started for the non-Native people in 1969, but for us as Two-Spirit people, it started at the beginning of time for us. And so we have to always counter those stories. And I think that if we continually contextualize the LGBT movement on this time frame of like either 1948 with the founding of the Madison Society by Harry Hay, or the Stonewall riots in 1969, that's colonizing our history. And we have to decolonize that. So that speaks to the rub, as well as looking for those intersections in which that we can actually join and partner with the larger LGBT movement. But I will say that a big challenge for the Two-Spirit community is the Native community doesn't count us, the LGBT community doesn't count us, and as a result, there's such little research or analysis of who we are as Two-Spirit people. And so we have to be, again, it's a two-pronged fight or battle and advocacy efforts of working within the LGBT movement and working within the Native community. So I think that is it. So I would like to thank you very, very much for taking the time for today's discussion. All my contact information is online. If you would like to ask me a question, shoot me an email and I'll be more than happy to answer any question or provide any additional information. Thank you very much once again. Hi, Examaga.
Thank you again, Harlan, for that incredible presentation. So very informative. Again, I would like to ask folks to please fill out the evaluation form before you leave the room. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation today. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And join us for the other series coming up from ANA.